Now, just a bit about transportation, the backstory. The first convicts arrived with the First Fleet in 1788. The last would finally disembark at Fremantle in 1868. During those 80 years, somewhere in the region of 165,000 men, women and children would be transported to the Australian colonies. A mass enforced migration. Around 72,000 of these would be sent to Van Diemen's Land. The popular view that Australia was just a dumping ground for British criminals is more or less correct, but far too simple. Let's take a moment to consider the bigger picture. Britain was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, a time of great social upheaval where everything changed and nothing would ever be the same. Also, changes in agriculture meant that large numbers of people who had been existing within a predominantly rural agrarian society would make for the towns and cities looking for work which, for so many, was simply not there. This sudden migration into towns and cities caused gross overcrowding, which resulted in filth and squalor, inevitable disease, crushing poverty, and, as a consequence, an unprecedented wave of crime. Stealing and thieving became a means of survival. If caught, the consequences would be dire. Over 220 crimes were punishable by death, and British prisons could at best be described as nothing more than vile, overcrowded holding pens. One solution was transportation. And transported convicts could be very useful. A coerced labour force who would work to help establish and build the colonies. They would clear the land, break the ground, so to speak. This would very much be the case with New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. The possession of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land gave the British a much-needed presence in the Southern Hemisphere, facilitating valuable trade throughout the regions of Southeast Asia and expanding their empire in both strategic and financial competition with the Dutch and French, the other superpowers. There was also the hope that these new colonies would somewhat alleviate the loss of the American colonies. Typical crimes leading to transportation were of petty larceny or petty theft, and generally the majority of those transported had prior convictions. Contrary to popular belief, transportation of first offenders was very rare. Some examples of convicts who would find their way to Port Arthur include Thomas Walker, who was transported for stealing a handkerchief and a quantity of coin. Later at Port Arthur, he would steal the Commandant's boat. James Gavigan was 11 years old when he got 7 years for stealing 21 umbrellas. James Forbes sentenced to 7 years for stealing a horse and a cow. James Bull, 10 years for stealing a bucket of soot. People were sentenced to transportation for theft, forgery, embezzlement, political crimes, highway robbery, assaults, court-martialed soldiers, and Dennis Collins threw a rock at the king. But when it comes to that old favourite story of convicts being transported for a first offence of merely stealing a loaf of bread, among the surviving Van Diemen's Land records, we've only found evidence of one. Thomas Winter was 15 years old when transported 7 years for stealing bread. There are no priors listed. The judge must have been having a very bad day. As he was only 15, Winter was sent directly to Point Poor. Where did the story end? Samuel Speed was among the last convicts transported to Fremantle in 1868. He was in his early 20s, homeless and begging for food when sentenced to 7 years for deliberately setting fire to a haystack. He is believed to be the last surviving convict. Sam was in his late 90s when he died in 1938, 150 years after the First Fleet arrived and only 1 year before World War II began. So what was the outcome for the majority of convicts? English social reformer Jeremy Bentham would refer to those transported as an excrementitious mass. But naturalist Charles Darwin had a very different assessment of transportation after visiting Australia, including Hobart, as part of his epic 5-year global circumnavigation. In 1836 he commented, "As a means of making men outwardly honest, of converting vagabonds, most useless in one country, into active citizens of another, and thus giving birth to a new and splendid country, it has succeeded to a degree perhaps unparalleled in history." For so many people, being transported was simply the best thing that could have happened. Port Arthur convicts could not be numbered among them.